good morning to Jamie and good afternoon to everybody else. I hope you can hear me. I will not put on my camera for now. I'm in Juba, and my internet may not be very strong for me to use the camera. But I want to say first, thank you so much for making time to join us for this third technical working group meeting for the Localizing Women's Economic Empowerment. Just in case there is somebody who does not know me, my name is Jacqueline Muthura. I am co-chair of this working group. I co-chair this working group with Asaya Imaya from the Collaborative Action for Childcare and Uthabiti Africa. And it is a privilege for me to start us off in this meeting. Today we are very excited. We are lucky to have Jamie with us, and I'm looking forward to his presentation. We will be having a reflection on the discussions that we had last time. Sylvia will take us through some of the key outcomes of the last meeting. She was gracious enough to do the minutes. She's going to give us a little bit of a background of what we discussed last time, and we will also discuss some of the thoughts that we had on what counties should be doing. We will have a presentation by Jamie on the role of the public sector. Before we go into the political economy analysis, it's important that for us to understand what is the role of the public sector, what is the role, and what are some of the things that can be done by non-public actors. What should also be the functional assignments between different levels of government, because he's an expert in intergovernmental relations. So we have privilege to have him unpacking that for us. And what is a political, are we together? What is a political economy analysis? And then after that, we will have a preliminary discussion on sort of the political economy analysis of provision of childcare. Why are the county governments not providing the childcare services as we envisioned last time? So it's going to be a preliminary discussion. We will unpack this further during our May meeting, which shall be held at the Emara Ole Sereni in May, on the 23rd of May this year. And this is, first of all, an invitation. I hope you received my email to block your calendars for this day. We shall have this meeting for half a day this time, not a full day. Jamie was very adamant and an advocate for doing it for half a day. We shall have this, we will be sharing with you the agenda a little later in the week or next week, but we will have a discussion on really a deep dive into why is there a gap between the actual and the desired situation with regards to provision of childcare. Yes, I was talking about the in-person meeting that will be taking place on the 23rd of May. And I will be sharing a link for us to confirm our participation. And also I will be sharing an agenda a little later in the month, but in advance of the meeting for us to prepare. As I said, it's going to be a half-day meeting. Please block your calendars, and we really look forward to seeing you there. We will be unpacking why is it that the counties are not providing the childcare services, or why is it that there is a gap between our envisioned, situation or desired situation and the actual situation. Yes. So for this meeting, I hope we are together. Yes, I would like to ask for us to just take a minute to reflect on where are we in the mood framework. We mentioned earlier in the meetings, in the earlier meetings, that we would be going through the mood assessment framework, which is the multi-level governance as an opportunity or obstacle to development, for us focusing on affordable and safe childcare. And we did the problem identification during the first During the first technical working group meetings, we also developed a theory of change. We undertook an initial stakeholder mapping, which we also presented last month, and also identified what are the current actors doing, what is the current situation, and also what are some of the multi-level governance obstacles, what are some of the challenges in terms of provision of affordable and safe childcare in Kenya. And with that, right now we are in between identifying multi-level governance obstacles and conducting a political economy. So we decided, let's take a breather before we go into the political economy analysis and understand the role of the public sector. Essentially, how does public sector work? And Jamie is going to be taking us through that session. So then within the main meeting, as I mentioned, we will be taking a deep dive into the political economy analysis. So remember, this is what we are doing as a technical working group through this year. Again, as I mentioned last time, we are first of all taking a broad brush at the issue, and then we will really get into the nitty-gritties in the second half of the year. With that, I would like to invite Sylvia to take us through a recap of what we discussed in the last meeting. Sylvia?
Thank you, Jackie. Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Sylvia, and I'll be taking us through what we discussed last time. Of importance is for us to remind ourselves in terms of the definition of childcare, because this is the key area that we are going to focus on. For what we discussed last time, we agreed that childcare is a central institution that provides supervision and care for the infants and the young ones during daytime or at night, so that their parents can hold on to jobs. So when it comes to childcare providers, we're looking at individuals or enterprises that basically own or manage or operate childcare group or childcare centers. Now, with this in mind, next slide, Jackie. With this in mind, from our previous discussion, we were able to identify some of the MLG obstacles. Mostly in terms of the county governments, we found that most of the county governments depend on the existing national childcare policies, which on their own cannot really address the challenges that are faced in the counties. For instance, we are talking about the absence of childcare specific policies, which particularly are tailored towards addressing the needs of children aged between 0 to 3 years. So a few of the county governments are really trying to make effort to develop or to come up with their own policies, but still there is that issue when it comes to implementation, because the implementation of the childcare initiatives within these county governments is not necessarily child-led. When it comes to funding, the development partners mostly engage the civil society organizations rather than working directly with the county governments, which basically makes it very difficult to understand the contribution of counties in such partnerships. And again, bypassing the county governments also contributes to lack of clarity when it comes to budgetary allocation and also in terms of implementation mechanism. Based on our definition, therefore, it is not clear where childcare lies. Does it lie within the early childhood education development? Is it within the social services? Is it within the child protection, or is it within the social service? So ideally, we say that there is no clarity in administrative structure of the childcare within the county governments, which basically makes it more difficult to understand which department is responsible, and there might be no dedicated officers on childcare for that case. The other interesting issue that we discussed within the MLG obstacles is with regards to existing childcare services. We see that the civil society usually primarily target the low-income women in terms of provision of childcare services, and they exclude the other women who may be in the corporate world or in the corporate field, who might also require the same service. So there is also need. This basically highlighted the need of having a more inclusive approach when it comes to childcare service provision. The other one was on county governments, which rarely or the other one was on county governments, which rarely work on building capacity building initiatives for the childcare service providers. Most of the childcare capacity building initiatives are usually happening at the national level, which basically leaves now the county governments ill-equipped in terms of implementing the same service effectively. Back to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just want to emphasize on something that you mentioned, the issue of lack of clarity on where childcare lies or where it could be best placed, whether it is under education, social services, or child protection. Because one of the things that came out from the discussion is someone cautioned us, oh, you cannot say that counties are not investing in childcare, but then it depends also on our understanding of childcare, because what you find that counties are investing in child protection, or there are budgetary allocations for child protection, but in actual sense, when you look at childcare as we have defined it, then it becomes very hazy. You know, are counties actually investing in terms of into daycare and night care centers? So thank you for that summary. And then you find that when we look at the issues that we identified as obstacles or gaps or issues we feel that or challenges within the childcare ecosystem, that sort of guided what then we believe counties should be doing. So I tried to recategorize the ideas that we came up with into the three aspects of regulation and policy development, implementation, and funding. And when you look at regulation, what do we think the counties should be doing? First of all, based again on that discussion on the challenges that that we identified or counties are facing, is there was a strong feeling that or a strong position that counties should be domesticating national childcare policies. Not all counties have childcare policies. We don't know how many. Hopefully that CREW will be able to tell us within the next few months how many counties actually have childcare policies. And there was also the issue of there might be childcare facility acts within some counties, but then the process of developing these childcare facilities was not inclusive, was not collaborative, and is also outdated. So the issue of updating these childcare facilities where they exist came out, and that counties should be working on. Another issue that was very, very strongly advocated for by the technical working group was the provision of guidelines and standards, or developing guidelines and standards for the operation of childcare centers, particularly on the issue of safety. And with this also came in the idea of the county should provide a model childcare facility, and not just provide a model childcare facility or guidelines and standards, but actually looking at that these guidelines are implemented. There is compliance checks, there are inspections. So this came out very strongly. The question of whether the county should be doing the inspections and the regulation of the sector itself or through a second party, that has not yet been discussed. And hopefully the models that are being developed or the exploration of the models of regulation, implementation, and funding could also better guide us on that. With developing childcare, with developing the childcare guidelines and standards, the idea also came up, can we categorize these daycare centers? And for us to categorize, do we have a database of the childcare centers that are there within the country and within a county? What kind of childcare centers are there? So then the idea came up, the counties should know how many daycare centers there are, what kind of daycare centers do we have? And then the question, of course, comes in, how can counties incentivize childcare centers to register or to formalize, and how do we develop that? Is it through subsidies? There was a suggestion on providing subsidies to compliant childcare centers and so on and so forth. What kind of subsidies? Again, depending on the type of daycare center. So these are some of the ideas that we came up with in terms of regulation of county government of childcare centers and childcare providers. When we look at implementation, again, we had interesting ideas coming up of what counties should be doing. One, of course, there was the idea that within markets, within public sectors, matatu, where matatus converge, within healthcare facilities, within county offices themselves, within universities, counties should be providing childcare facilities. So now there are two schools of thought. Counties should provide this, should run some of these childcare facilities, or they can partner with civil society organizations, or social enterprises, or even private sector actors. And this means not just people who are providing childcare facilities as a business, but also companies like, the way Safaricom has provided a creche for children. Can the Britams and the other companies within the county provide a space for daycare centers? So partnering with counties to provide childcare facilities, whether that is in public spaces or even in private companies. Private spaces. So the idea of partnering with civil society, with non-public actors came out strongly. How that again would be structured, we are yet to think through. Would the counties say subcontract one actor to manage all the daycare facilities, or subcontract different actors? What kind of mechanisms would that look like? So hopefully the research or the paper on models would be able to advise us better on that. Of course, the issue of expanding the scope of beneficiaries beyond low-income women came up again, so that then if it's going to make economic sense and have a wider economic impact, then we need to look beyond women in informal settlements. We need to look beyond market traders. Another role that we felt that the county should be playing is training and certification of childcare service providers. And I think this goes back to the issue of regulations and standards and ensuring compliance, and supporting childcare service providers to achieve compliance and the standards that are needed. There was also the issue of providing subsidies for childcare, particularly looking now at the low-income population, and probably linking that to encouraging the service providers to also be compliant. So those are some of the ideas that came out so far. We have not yet had an example on, or an idea or a thought on how would counties fund this, And we are very happy that I know we have IPF in the room, so they probably already have some ideas on how would that be done, or how can that be done in terms of funding. How do counties finance this? So I want to take a minute at this point and ask if there are any thoughts on particularly this slide. What should counties be doing? Since last meeting, have we had any other ideas? Additional ideas, or what counties should be doing? Does this reflect also what the technical working group thinks we should be working on, or the counties should be doing? So I want to take a minute. Please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and share any thoughts that you might have. Does this represent what we discussed? Is there something that, after thinking over, maybe should be added or removed to this conversation? Any thoughts? I don't want to pick out people. I hope I'm still in the room. Do we have any additional thoughts? Marion, you were not there in the last meeting. Do you agree with this idea? Yeah, thank you, Marion.
Sorry, I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't in the last meeting, but yes, I do agree with the ideas. I look at the ideas and yeah, I'm in agreement.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Penina, is there any additional thoughts that you had?
No, you're very comprehensive, and I'm looking forward to the next proceedings. But
You're very articulate. Keep up.
Thank you. That's a biased compliment, but thank you. Anyone else? George, any thoughts? Are we in agreement? Anything that we think that might have been left out, or we feel maybe this is not the role of the county governments, that probably should be a
Thanks for the
non-public actor? Yeah.
yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I wasn't part of the last meeting, but I think I also do agree that these are some of the issues that county governments should be able to look into. Yeah, yeah, over.
Okay.
Thanks. Mm.
Thank you. I don't know if Asaya, you want to add to this before we move on to the next presentation?
No, not really. I think it's very comprehensive. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to hand over then to Jamie, who is going to take us through a presentation on the role of the public sector and the different functional assignments amongst the different levels of government. Before we dive into, so why is the county not doing this? This is what the county should be doing, but why is the county not implementing this mandate, even as we know that this is a mandate of the county and this is what they should be doing, but why is that not the case? So I will invite Jamie. Thank you, Jamie.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning from Washington. Thanks so much. Before I dive into the slides, let me maybe try to connect where the conversation was and where it is going. Myself, I did not attend the last meeting either, and so it was good to learn that conversations about what county should be doing is evolving, and as intended in a way. The work of the technical working group is not always linear. It is going forward, but often you need to kind of revisit and think through and take a step back and look to see does what we're saying make sense, and where is it going next. And I think the next big question coming up is if we have some sense of what we want counties to be doing, but they're not doing it today, a whole series of questions are coming up. Why are our ideas about what the county should be doing, do they make sense themselves? Are the ideas that we bring to the table, are they good ones? And if they are, then how should they be worked out? And there's a lot of details, obviously, once you say the county should be doing this. If that is a recommendation that comes from us, we should be able to provide details, who should be doing it, which department, how much money is this going to cost, and so forth. But it will also have to cause us to reflect on why is it not happening, or what is the challenge in putting that into action? Because if we want to advocate for that, we're going to have to be smart and understand how both county bureaucracy as well as county political decision-making works, because we're going to need the cooperation and the collaboration of both the administrators as well as the elected leadership of counties, and possibly even bureaucrats and elected leaders nationally. So there are a number of questions that the suggestions that were brought up last week bring to bear. Now, Jackie hasn't teased me this session yet for being an economist, but I am an economist. And I tend to look at, and I've studied for most of my career, exactly these kind of decisions. So Jackie asked me, maybe this time I can spend a little bit of time together with you, walking through and talking through a few basic principles of how an economist who works on intergovernmental finance looks at the issues you've been discussing. And then the idea is that due to circumstances, I'll be in person in Kenya in about 1 month's time. so that we would then reconvene in a month in person, as Jackie mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, so that we can continue the discussion, but really talk about the ideas that you brought up last time and see what are the root causes of why those things aren't happening. Right, so that's the thought behind it. Is that everyone's happy with that? Or, you know, if you don't want to have a half-hour lecture on economics or policy making, please let me know now. Otherwise, you know, I might see you fall asleep, or you will put little Z icons in Zoom. But would that be a helpful thing before I dive in? You know, and of course, for those who are not with us, they could potentially watch the video. But is that an okay plan? I see at least one thumbs up. Do I see more? Do I see a second somewhere? A second thumbs up? Marion, that would be useful. George, your Penina, everyone would be okay with that? All right. All right. Let me switch to my slides if I can. And it is increasingly dangerous for me to do stuff like this without my reading glasses on. But I think if I click there, hopefully that says share and not disconnect. There we go. I think. Are you seeing my main screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Very good. Let me turn off my camera because you care more about the slides than about myself. There we go. And please feel free to jump in if you have questions, or I'm going to try to break things up in small pieces so I don't talk too much, because some of you, when we were together in early March or late Feb, you know, once I get on a roll, I can talk forever about decentralization. So I broke up the things I want to share with you in three small buckets. I want to check in with you after every section just to get your feedback and if there's need for clarification. But basically, I'm hoping to talk 10-15 minutes about three things. One, what's the role of the public sector as economists see it? What, you know, and obviously I will tie that to what's the role of the public sector in childcare? What government level should do what? What is the theory that we use? What are the kind of key concepts that we use to decide in a country that has more than one government level, like national government, county government, but it could be in the US, we have federal, state, and local, or in any country, what government level should do what? And then the third topic that I'd like to address is the basics of political economy analysis. Apologies for the typo there. So those are the three topics. I want to spend 10-15 minutes on each. And as I said, I will take a break after each for questions and answers. We'll record the video. Hopefully we can make it available and for those who are not with us today. On the role of the public sector, I think a very important concept, if we just think about societies and development and sustainable development and inclusive development, I think the first thing to realize, and for many of you this may be obvious, but it's useful, I think, as a starting point for the conversation, is that the decisions and activities of households and businesses form the primary driving force behind sustainable human development. That is obvious mostly for people who don't work for government, but people who work for government or development partners sometimes forget that. With that said, the public sector, what we often refer to as government, can be a catalyst for development by doing things that households and businesses don't necessarily do well by themselves. And governments can be a catalyst for development by providing public infrastructure and services that the market fails to provide efficiently. And things like roads are not well built by market forces, but most of the things we consume and produce can be easily consumed and produced best by market actors. So we turn to the government as a catalyst for development, really only in the cases where households and businesses don't do something well without government. Now, at the same time, I think it's an important observation that sometimes the government or the public sector doesn't really work in an efficient, inclusive, or responsive manner. If there's corruption, if there's inefficiency, if government systems don't work well, then the public sector can itself become an obstacle to development rather than as a catalyst. And so we need to kind of be on the lookout for that. And when we see this happen, we need to take that into account. And I think finally, development, if we want it to be inclusive and sustainable, requires a whole of society approach. It requires, if we have multiple government levels, it requires every government level and civil society to work together. Just as a basis or a foundation for discussion. Now, then comes the question: what is a government? And I think Mensur Olsen, who is one of the leading thinkers in this and wrote a lot about this in the 1960s and 70s, who did not win the Nobel Prize, but others did around similar work, basically said government, and this could be at different levels, national government or county government, are platforms for collective decision-making and collective action. That's really the simplest breakdown of what a government is. Governments are clubs that you belong to depending on where you live. And that club's role is to make decisions together and provide services that are not necessarily well provided by people individually or by businesses individually. And the basic thinking is that these clubs should provide public services or make investments whenever the benefits to the members of the club exceed the costs to the members of the club. And with that in mind, different collective decisions are best made depending on the scale of the club. So we might have local governments or local clubs that allow local residents to work together to provide exclusively local services such as parks, secondary roads, solid waste management, things of local nature that benefit local residents, and therefore local residents are willing to contribute to the club or to the local government in terms of taxes. We might have regional governments or regional clubs where residents of a region might want to have certain services, regional hospitals, regional highways, that need to be organized at that scale in order to be viable, to make sure that costs and benefits are balanced. So if there are services of regional scale, we form regional clubs, sometimes called regional governments in the US state government. And then certain services and certain things we do together at national scale, and through national governments or national groups, that cannot be done at local or regional level. For instance, national defense would make more sense to be provided at national level rather than at local or regional level. Tanzania is going to be much more scared of Kenya if it faces the Kenyan army as opposed to 47 county armies. So we decide at what scale services are best provided based on the costs and benefits to the members of the clubs at different levels. But ultimately, that's all government is. Government is people coming together to form a club for collective decision-making and collective action. And we want clubs to make those decisions, and their members will support those decisions if the costs are outweighed by benefits. So that just, I think, very important to keep in mind as the concept of government. It's just a collective decision-making mechanism. It's nothing, there's nothing really special about it. And if government doesn't perform that function well, you end up having obviously civil discord and other tensions and conflict. Now, as economists, we think about the role of government along three different lines. Again, and I should qualify, this is as economists who think, who predominantly think about markets being efficient under certain conditions. So if we think generally, the market will provide many things well in an efficient manner under certain conditions, then what is the role of government in the economy? And this is predominantly the writing of Richard and Peggy Musgrave. Richard Musgrave and Peggy Musgrave. I think Peggy may still actually be alive, but I know Richard has passed away. Again, Richard Musgrave is often referred to as the father or grandfather of modern public finance. He collaborated to get with his wife, Peggy. This was at a time that women were not allowed in academia in the same way they are and accepted today, but they were quite progressive and wrote many of their books together. So I think it's important to give both of them, they said economic roles of public sector are to provide a stable economic environment, to promote more equitable distribution of income, and to assure more efficient allocation of resources when markets fail. Okay, and what did they mean by that? In order for a market to work well, it must operate in a stable economic environment. Because in order to have a stable economy, we must have money, because that is much more efficient than bartering. In order to have a stable economic environment, we must have access to international trade, because we might want to buy things from other countries and we want to sell things to other countries. One of the government's is to make sure that there is a stable economic environment. The economic role of government under the same header is also that there should be the enforcement of property rights. If it is easier for me to steal things than it is to produce things, no one's going to produce anything. So we need to make sure that we have a system of justice, courts, rule of law, police, prosecutors, to make sure that we all have what is ours, and we can't easily steal property from others. And if we do, that there is a mechanism for resolving that, so that we all have reasons to produce and provide our labor and be economically productive. Without that, society and markets won't work. In addition, governments often regulate markets to facilitate fair and efficient market transactions. If I can sell a gallon of or a liter of a vegetable oil and say it's motor oil, then obviously I can make money on that transaction, but it's not good for the market. If I can water down my milk and sell it as milk, but in fact it's 2/3 water, that yes, I may make some money, but in the long run, it's bad for transactions. So there's a number of consumer protection, product safety, product information disclosures and labeling and product standardization types of rules and regulations that countries impose for the purpose of ensuring that markets work well, right? Because markets only work well when producers and consumers know what they're buying, and that they have the information needed to make informed economic decisions. So all of that's a role of government. Without that, markets and economies don't work well. Second role of government, promoting more equitable and fair distribution of income. That could be done through social protection programs. It could be done through taxing the wealthy more than the poor, through progressive taxation, or and more equitable distribution of income and resources can be achieved by providing free or reduced cost access to publicly provided services. Because public services are really income to people. If you give universal access to free healthcare, that means that poor families can afford healthcare, whereas without government providing that, they don't have that access. And so that those services they receive are in fact kind of like income to people. And there's actually a definition of income called the Haig-Simons-Thibault definition of income that emphasizes that. So those are three important ways for governments to promote a more equitable, fair distribution of income and resources. And finally, governments can assure a more efficient allocation of resources when markets fail. For those of you who are economists, we have three main market failures where the government tends to step in. First of all, when there are non-competitive market structures, such as monopolies, right, where there's only one provider. If there's only one provider, they tend to charge high prices for their products because there are no competitive pressures. So those monopolies need to be regulated. There are cases of spillovers. When you produce something that has a positive or negative impact or externality on others in society, then government can intervene to regulate it or tax it or subsidize it. For instance, if I'm a polluting plant, then either the government can regulate me and simply say you may not put your pollutants in the river, or they may tax me so that they may allow me to pollute, but only if I pay a tax to reduce pollution, right? Often governments tax tobacco and alcohol and other things in order to not necessarily forbid them, but to discourage consumers from using them. Likewise, governments can promote the use of positive things that have positive spillovers and subsidize merit goods, as it were. So if there are things that have a positive spillover on society, these could be subsidized. Finally, there are certain types of goods, such as national defense, which I already mentioned, that are what we call public goods. They are not rival and not excludable. So they're not just provided by the government. Often we use public goods as a catch-all term for any goods provided by government, but public goods in economic terms means goods that are non-rival, non-excludable. So the enjoyment of one person does not limit the enjoyment of the same good by another person, and it's not excludable means it's impractical or costly to exclude people from enjoying the use of the good. So for instance, fireworks or a nice park, it doesn't make sense to put a big fence around a nice park, but once you allow people in, multiple people can enjoy the same park, so that's considered a public good. So these are the reasons why we believe the government should step into the economy. Now, question for you, is there an economic argument for government to promote childcare? And if so, what is it? I can't see on my screen, but feel free to just unmute yourself and say, why do you think in this constellation of things, what's the economic argument for government to step into childcare? Is there one? Anyone? I'm throwing the floor open to you.
Hello.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think thank you very much for these introductory statements. I think there is an imperative for government, an economic imperative and argument for government to promote childcare because primarily I can look at argument number two. Maybe there could be ways in which the other two arguments could also suffice, but to promote a more equitable distribution of income or resources. So it is often the case that childcare, quality childcare could be out of reach of low-income families or households. Also, there could be that there is no possibility for them to be provided where they stay. For example, people live in informal settlements or low-income neighborhoods. In such cases, maybe there would be no incentive for a provider to put a childcare in such places at affordable prices. So in this case, it would be a good argument for government to come in and put up publicly funded daycare services. So to just really balance out the the distribution of the resource. Thanks.
Am I outlining it well on the screen?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, correct.
All right. Any other reasons? Thank you for that contribution. Or is that the main one? Yes, please.
Can I also contribute? Yeah. Penina Ndegwa from Wow Mom. So I think in addition to what has been said, is also to provide stable economic environment. For example, in our case where we have the childcare services provided in the market centers, is to make sure that more women can actually continue engaging in the trading activities. The more the women are able to thrive in their businesses, the more women are able to, to pay more in terms of services within the county, including paying their business permits and even accessing financial services, even in the banks and all that. And also in addition to that, it's also a way of providing enforcement of rights in terms of, setting the precedent on how childcare services are supposed to be done. I think the first one really speaks so much into what we're doing with the county government of Nairobi, because yes, we are supporting the traders, but we're also setting the standards as to how the cares need to be designed and managed and operated. So,
Penina,
yeah.
let me ask you, why is the standard setting so important? What is that on this screen already, or is this unique to childcare, you think?
I think in everything, if you realize, like if you think about even healthcare, for example, or even education, like general education, like the private sector comes into, to up the game, like to do something extra more than what the government has provided. If you look at a government, like a level 4 hospital, if you compare Kenyatta National Hospital and Nairobi Hospital, yes, Nairobi Hospital has met all the criteria that Kenyatta Hospital has, but of course, providing a more premium service. So if a government does something in terms of like what we've done for Morero Market, it's highly likely that now private sector coming in to provide similar childcare services have a reference point, and they will not be going lower than what the government can provide. If anything, they'll be going better. And in that, as a result, lead to having proper or higher quality standards of daycare facilities provided.
Let me ask you this, though, if
I don't know
if I can follow up on that, because that is a public sector example you are giving, but I'm but I suspect there is a more general comparison. Now, I don't know about Kenya, so I'm going to ask you, when you go to the grocery store and buy a liter of milk or a liter, any other product, does the government regulate the basic safety and of that product and define, that you're not allowed to water it down, or does that not happen in Kenya?
Well, I may be guided, but if I remember or at least analyze the Kenyan context keenly, I think from what I've seen is that there's almost a parastatal, government-owned parastatal in almost every sector in government, including milk. Like we had KCC, Kenya, I can't even remember the correct name, but we do have KCC, which is a government-owned milk brand, for example. And of course, we've had so many others, private, coming up, which of course, in my opinion, are more premium than what the government provides. So it still goes to back to the same thing that I'm saying, that government sets the precedent. And so the private sector tries to up the game, like provide a more premium service to remain competitive, because the government is more affordable, because government will charge less in terms of the, if they're selling it, they will charge less as opposed to, because of course they have a lot of subsidy, they have the machineries in terms of purchasing the facilities or equipment that would make them, provide the services cheaper.
But I guess I'm
Jamie,
sorry.
can I come in?
I'm not being. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I want to go back to your issue of the milk and connect it to the children. If you are poisoning people you are a private actor selling milk and that does not meet the standards, the government will come for you, whether the government provides milk or not. So I'm going towards the consumer protection statement on the screen, where I believe the government has a mandate to protect children who are who are being taken care of by different service providers, whether these service providers are government linked or private sector, or whether that facility is run by the private sector or the government. So I feel that comes into market regulation, that the government has a mandate to make sure that the children are actually safe, and that as a consumer of the childcare facility, that I'm getting what I'm paying for. I'm getting quality. Yeah, that is my thought.
So thanks for that. And that was a little bit what I was angling at. Now, Penina, for your reference, I live in a country where the government doesn't provide any milk or any product pretty much that is available. But government does regulate the private sector because they're protecting me as a consumer, so that when I go to the store and I buy a liter of milk, I know I'm not buying chalk water so that the milk producer can make lots of money, or that it's watered down. So most every country, and I suspect Kenya does too, has standards in place to say, if you sell something labeled orange juice, it must contain juice from oranges, right? However detailed or not detailed these rules are, they allow me to go to a store and buy a product with confidence and knowing what I'm getting. And without that knowledge, the market's not going to work well, right? And as Jackie just mentioned, that translates into childcare, because if I don't know whether my kid is going to get hit, or it's it's an unsafe place, blah, 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 then I don't know as a consumer how much that is worth to me, because I'm not sure what product I am really buying. And so I think there's a very strong case for regulation and promotion of childcare around protecting consumers and making sure that consumers get what they pay for and that the product that they're buying is safe. And without the government stepping in and doing that, it would not be, people may choose not to buy a product. And in a way, childcare is just a product. They might not choose to buy that product because they don't know what they're really buying. And so regulation can really help, advance a product by making sure there are standardization and consumer protections. I mean, think about electronics. You would not buy a phone that cannot plug into the wall, right? If there would not be standardization on the wall plug. Or you would not buy products if you knew that you plugged it in, they're going to electrocute you. And so there are some degree of regulation by government that electronic products should be safe and maybe registered and so forth. Now, in interest of time, I'm going to highlight one more issue, and that is the subsidization of merit goods, right? And I by the way, I like very much the labor force participation point you made. It's part of a stable economic environment, but also in a way, the same argument can be made and say it's a merit good. If families buy more childcare, then they can go to work and pay more taxes, and that's good for society. So childcare can be seen as a merit good. In addition, if it is high quality childcare, not only are the parents benefiting and society benefiting off of that, but the children are going to be better educated, better behaved, healthier, better socialized. So if we have high quality childcare, there is a positive externality on society from that in different ways. So I think there's a strong case here that there are a lot of good reasons for childcare to be provided by the government or to be promoted and regulated by government. So in my, I think I have to clear my annotations somehow, otherwise they'll stay on the screen. There we go, modern technology. So there's lots of reasons for there to be for government to be involved in childcare, for the public sector to be involved. Again, in the interest of time, let me move on. Very good contributions. Thank you for that. Goes to this next question. If we think government should be involved, who should be involved? And I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but just to touch on the key points and the key definitions. Again, how people working on this in government, what we call intergovernmental relations or intergovernmental finance, how we think about that. Now, from the finance point of view or the fiscal point of view, we consider this topic to be the assignment of functions and expenditure responsibilities, which is the decision which government level should be doing what. And after that, we tend to think about, once we decide that, we tend to think of how should governments at different levels fund the activities, their responsibilities, of whether those and the funding options are own source revenues or revenue sources, taxes and non-tax revenues. We could give intergovernmental fiscal transfers or grants, right? That could be provided in different ways. And we can allow or require local governments, subnational governments to have, to borrow money or not, and incur debt and fund things certain ways through borrowing. So those are, we consider those to be the 4 pillars of fiscal decentralization. Today, we're going to talk about that first pillar, the assignment of functions and responsibilities. Who should do what? And I want to touch on 2 or 3 core principles of that. And the most important principle, if you work in the field of decentralization or devolution or subnational finance, you know this principle. But outside of this small world, this is not a well-known principle. It's called the subsidiarity principle. And this principle says that government services should be provided at the lowest government level that can do so efficiently. Right? So if we're talking about the promotion of childcare services, we believe, and in Europe, there's actually an international agreement called the European Charter of Local Self-Government that says government services in the EU, but most people, even outside the EU, believe in this principle. Government services should be provided at the lowest government level that can provide that service efficiently. Now, it doesn't say that government services should be provided at the lowest level, because often small local governments cannot provide public services efficiently. Many countries have like a village level government. And, you know, can villages provide national defense? No, they cannot. They're too small. Can they run schools efficiently? Typically not. It would be very inefficient if every village in a country needed an education officer and a health officer, because you might have one health facility. So it's scale economies, right? Which is the economic concept that things can be produced more cheaply at scale, often prevent public services from being delivered at the lowest level following this principle, because it would be tremendously expensive. So we try to find the lowest level of government that can provide services efficiently. That's a principle that is kind of like our gold standard. And that ends up being, so for instance, national defense, the lowest level that can provide defense efficiently is the national level, sometimes maybe even regionally. The lowest government level that can run schools tends to be, if we look at the economics of it, jurisdictions that have maybe 100,000 residents or more. And so the lowest level in Kenya that could do so would be the county government. So many services actually can be efficiently provided at the county government level in Kenya. Now, we just said Richard and Peggy Musgrave had 3 basic kind of functions of economic functions of the public sector. If we apply the subsidiarity principle to those, Generally, as a general rule, these are general rules. Providing a stable economic environment is typically left best to the central government. It would not make sense for local governments to print money or to have, enforce property rights. That would be problematic. That is typically done most efficiently at the central government level. Could not be done efficiently locally. Likewise, the equitable distribution of resources cannot also be done subnationally. If you try to redistribute income subnationally, so let's say a county government, if Nairobi County would impose a 20% tax if they were allowed on income, everyone who has some money is going to move right across the border outside of Nairobi County, where the taxes are 10% less. And while that may not happen right now in Kenya, that happens a lot in the US, where wealthy people move to jurisdictions with low local taxes. It's not a good idea to redistribute income at the local level. Market failure should be addressed by on the basis of the nature of the market failure. So, for instance, if an educated child will either move or pay taxes to the central government, to the national government, then the benefit of educating that child fall to the national government and not just the local government. So that spillover needs to dictate who should be paying for that child's education. In addition, even though the subsidiarity principle is really important, it also can be applied separately to different aspects of services, and we call that unbundling. So for every service, let's say education or health or childcare, there's a policy and regulation aspect, there's a financing aspect, there's something we call provision aspect, which is the government responsibility for ensuring the delivery and for ensuring oversight. And then there's the production, which is the actual physical delivery of the service. We can unbundle any service in those four dimensions and separately assign who should do what based on the subsidiarity principle. Who is well positioned? What is the lowest government level that is can efficiently perform the function and the unbundled function efficiently. So if we apply the subsidiarity principle to policy and regulation, financing, provision, and production, I think what we often realize is that it would be quite inefficient for each county or each local government to come up with their own policies and regulations because it's very duplicative. So it would be much more efficient. And what we find is that in most countries, central government has sets the national policy, because for efficiency reasons, that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to have 47 education policies, 47 health policies. And counties may have some implementation choices, but the big outlines of national or government policy, development policy, typically set nationally, because that's the lowest level of government that can really do policy and regulation efficiently. Likewise, the responsibility for financing for many social services is central government or national government. Only in the cases where we're talking about local economic functions, such as little parks, maybe secondary roads, those small local things can be funded locally. But things that we do for stabilization and income redistribution purposes, they should be financed nationally. Because the benefits of a more equitable society, the benefits of a stable economy often are captured better by the national government than by the county or local governments. So we're saying regulation for many functions should be national, financing should be national, but that doesn't mean provision should be national. If we apply the subsidiarity principle to many functions, we say, what is the lowest level of government that can provide childcare services or primary education services or primary health services? If we apply the subsidiarity principle, often this can be done efficiently by local government. And by provide, we make a distinction, as you will notice, with production. So production is actual delivery of the service. And we make a distinction between that. It may be the case that the government provides a service, but it provides a service by contracting the private sector. That is the production part. So solid waste can often be done best by solid waste management, can often be done best by local governments, but the local government may contract with a contractor to pick up the service, or it may simply regulate the service and allow certain contractors to be contracted by households and not even be in the middle. So similarly, childcare does not necessarily have to be provided by county governments, but the regulation, the provision, which is the regulation, potentially the funding and so forth, is the role of the government. But the production could either be the local government, the county government itself, or the private sector. Again, this is just a general application. And I'm going to skip this slide for a moment. The same is probably the case for when we apply the subsidiarity principle to different dimensions of childcare in Kenya. So if I were to ask the question, as I did before, in the case of Kenya, in the case of childcare, who would be most, if we're trying to find the government level closest to the people that is able to efficiently perform a function, and let me try to get my annotation back, which level of government would be the lowest level of government that can efficiently provide policies and regulation? Let me throw the floor open again. Are there any comments, any suggestions from you? George, earlier you took the first bite. Do you want to go again?
Okay, Jamie, let me try again. In applying the subsidiarity principle, it will be the county governments. Yeah, but again, this also in laws, in the constitution. So I think our constitution drafters must have been inspired or well guided by experts in this regard, in decentralization or devolution, to ensure that the lowest level of government, which is the county government, is the one that is charged with the role of childcare. Yeah.
Sure, but specifically to policy and regulation of childcare, and others should feel free to come in. Right? If we divide up childcare between policy and regulation of childcare, financing of childcare, the actual provision or the production. Now, the Constitution is a little bit vague. It says childcare is a county function. But does that mean everything should be done by the county? What if we apply the subsidiarity principle? And then we can compare against the law. I agree that the laws and Constitution are pretty good. But specifically on policy and regulation, would it be efficient for every county to come up with their own, policy and regulatory environment for childcare, and national government would not have to be involved? Or does would that not be efficient? Are there any thoughts on that question? Any? Messiah, what do you think? If I may volunteer you. Looks like George disconnected. Maybe he had some internet issues.
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Jamie, and I think George was right to refer to the brilliance of our constitution, and I think that's where the opportunity and also the dilemma sometimes exists as we discuss this issue, because the policy environment at national level is great, but sometimes it's confusing, as we've said. Responsibility for regulation and policy to some extent, particularly creating clarity in the implementation of such policies and regulations, sits with county governments. So I think it's an issue that needs to be to be carefully discussed, negotiated, and maybe responsibilities reaffirmed to some extent. But maybe we have always, again, within the ecosystem, we have always also sort of anticipated a scenario whereby this needs to be revisited ultimately, because it needs to work. It needs to work for children and caregivers, and just sticking to it because it was decided a couple of years ago is not good enough. And I think that's where we need to move into. I think part of what I hope from this conversation to get from this conversation is that we can begin to question whether the current approaches are really working. If they are working, how can we accelerate those reforms? If they are not working and there's need for a radical shift, then that becomes another focus of future regulatory reform. But certainly, from our work, if I were to put on my hat as with Abiti Africa for a minute, we've seen that in spite of the contradictions that might be there at national level, I think the county governments we've worked with are very clear on what their responsibilities are. It might not necessarily be always well thought out, but I think they understand what they need to do, and are willing to customize or rather to adapt the national regulatory framework and the policy framework and apply it at local level. Thank you.
No, thanks for that. I wrote tricky on the screen, and I'm going to maybe, for the interest of time, summarize where I think the marbles fall. And I think you're exactly right that it's always important to kind of not just follow the law, although you have to follow the Constitution and law, but wonder whether or not it is clear. And if I'm not mistaken, and it's quite possible that I am mistaken, but if I recall, actually, the Constitution says that policy and regulation is generally a national government framework. Childcare is a county responsibility. So now, where does policy and regulation for childcare fall? I don't know. And it's so that the answer there on policy and regulation is a bit tricky. If national government could do a good job, it would be inefficient for each county to develop its own policies and regulations. But if the national government doesn't necessarily do a good job, it may be necessary, as you say, for counties to find their way and implement their own. So it also has kind of to do with the ability of national government to do its own job. But I think it is important to realize that counties, it's not that efficient for every county to come up with its own policy, a set of policies and regulatory frameworks. There might be actually an argument for national government, but then again, that assumes national government is going to do a better job, and if they don't, it may have to be the counties filling the gap. I think for financing, provision, and production is very important on the financing side, that if the nation as a whole will benefit from greater fairness and from greater women's economic participation, which I think is the case, these are national equality and equity issues, then kind of the national government should pay, right? And also, from a strictly economic incentive, if a woman goes to work, which government level is going to benefit most from that? Or if a woman finishes her education, is it only going to be the county benefiting, or is it the nation as a whole benefiting? Particularly if women are mobile and they may get a university degree in one place and then move to another, Nairobi, Mombasa, bigger urban areas typically, but outside the county. Under all of these circumstances, it turns out that if you only count on county funding, counties will underfund childcare, and so therefore is an important role for the central government for the financing or the funding of childcare services and education services. At the same time, I think if we apply the subsidiarity principle to provision, it is clear that the counties, as the government closest to the people, can tailor childcare programs to local needs in a way that national government cannot do. And so they're much better positioned than national government to do the provision of county government services. And provision does not necessarily mean the production. The actual delivery may very well be done by the private sector. We know there are a number of private sector operators who are really good at this. Some of these are in the room today. And the private sector is well positioned to deliver or produce services, but the county would still have a very important role in regulation, oversight, funding, standard setting, and so forth. So we have a case in the case of childcare where there is a role for the private sector, there's a role for the county, there's a role for potentially national government, both in terms of funding and maybe even in regulation. So this is a function where all government levels have to work together based on the basic concepts of subsidiarity and fiscal decentralization. Now, I'm going to spend 2 minutes and then I'm going to hand over back to Jackie for maybe wrap up and next steps. Next session will be in person, which these things are much less sleep-inducing when you do them in person than over the internet. But I do want to touch very briefly on political economy analysis, because up to this point, we have talked about the assignment of functions as if it were a technical exercise. And unfortunately, reality is that it isn't. It is not. In fact, it is as much a political exercise, if not more, than it is a technical exercise. And the part of political science and political and economics that studies this is called political economy, or political economy analysis, which considers the prevailing political and economic processes in society by analyzing the incentives, relationship, distribution, and contestation of power between groups and individuals. And political economy analysis is concerned with understanding not just the values that organizations and institutions bring, but the interests and incentives facing different groups, particularly political elites, and how the contestation of power driven by the interest and incentives of different stakeholders generates different policy outcomes that may encourage or hinder development. All right, so basically, political economy is a completely different lens to look at how public policy is made, and may result in very different outcomes than the ones we desire based on technical grounds. On technical grounds, if we apply the subsidiarity principle, we probably would like national government to help fund county government implementation of childcare, and we would like county governments to contract with the private sector and subsidize the private sector to provide childcare services, because all of that would be good for the country. I think there's a strong technical argument, but that's not how governments make decisions. Governments make decisions based on institutional and political considerations. But if we want to make safe and quality childcare more accessible, we must make it more affordable. And this means that we need money from a government budget, either the national government, county government, or both, so that we can reduce the price ultimately paid by the consumer or beneficiary. Right? It's simple economics. Whether this is true, whether you sell childcare or widgets or milk or gasoline, we want something to become cheaper so that more people will use it. On top of that, as our discussion earlier pointed out, we also want to regulate it and standardize it so that people are more comfortable buying it with less risk, right? So we want to standardize the product by certifying or some kind of regulation to say this is a safe, this childcare provider meets certain standards, so you can easily, you know what you're buying. Right? So we want to do that, but we also want to lower the price, because when the price is lower and the risk is lower, consumers will buy more of something. So then the question is, how do we convince government, county or national or both, to take government money and provide subsidies, right? Subsidies may be provided for gasoline, subsidies may be provided for other things. As I mentioned earlier, government often taxes alcohol and cigarettes and other things because they're economic bads. So we impose sin taxes. So, but governments don't have endless amounts of money. So how do we shape the interests and the incentives of political decision makers and bureaucratic decision makers to support us, right? We want them to give some of the budget to our priorities, and we believe those priorities are good for the country as a whole, and they're good for certain groups, especially the recipients of the more affordable childcare. But for that, we're going to actually have to kind of engage in a power struggle. We're going to not just have to make good arguments. We're going to have to say what motivates a governor, what motivates a department head to act in the way that we would like them to act. So it's really important to view this not just as a good technical exercise, but a political economy exercise. I titled this slide, "How is the sausage really made?" Right? I mean, how does the government really work? And I think it's important at this stage to remind ourselves public policy decisions are seldom made based exclusively on values, right? You may have as a value that women's rights are human rights and that childcare is important for equal access to labor opportunities and so forth. Those are values, but unfortunately, decisions are only partially made on values. Decision makers, both elected and administrative leaders, are often influenced or driven by political economy forces. What is good for them politically, or what is good for them professionally or administratively. So their interests may not be the common interests of the people or the common interest of specific constituents. National and county politicians want to win elections. National and county bureaucrats want to often just have the biggest department. They want to have more budget and more staff. So they'll fight over stuff like this, even though it has nothing to do with the public interest. They may want to lobby for a function to be part of their department and not someone else's department if they think it's a function that is interesting to them. And households and businesses want low taxes and effective public services, right? And sometimes that's contradictory. And so if those are the things that provide incentives, and this is what the interests of different stakeholders are, now there's a free-for-all, a contestation of power, both between national government and county. National government prefers to keep money for itself rather than allocate a share to the counties. And at both levels, we're going to have a political contestation over the available resources, because just because something is a good thing to do, you know, every constituent is coming to the government and saying, I have another good idea. You should spend on water. You should spend on health. You should spend on this. What we have to do is, what is the value proposition for a decision maker to choose childcare over water, or childcare over another road? And what can convince the decision makers? What convinces politicians? What convinces the bureaucrats? What are the political arguments and incentives? What are the administrative arguments and incentives, or the economic arguments and incentives, right? That is really how the decision is going to be made about whether or not counties are going to do things and whether or not national governments are going to help contribute to that. And I think that is a really important reality that we live in. So we can't just say that childcare is important or there are social impacts that are good. Unfortunately, that's not what's going to convince most policymakers. Again, both elected and non-elected. And around the world, I think the lesson is that the political economy reality is that decentralization reforms and public service decisions most often go wrong in this, because national stakeholders, especially line ministries, don't want to decentralize authority and resources. So counties tend to be under-resourced, right? They just don't have, even though it looks like they have a lot of money, they don't. And what we end up seeing is gaps between what the law and the Constitution says and the reality, or the in practice de facto assignment of functions. And this misalignment is fundamental. This is not just a Kenya problem. This is a global problem until the public sector resolves it and says we need to put the national interest or the common interest ahead of department interest or political interest and so forth. So this is fundamental and needs to be resolved. because what we actually see in reality is not that finance should follow function, which is what we believe as technicians, right? The function is childcare, finance should flow there. Instead, finance follows politics in practice. That means that, as I already said, counties tend to be under-resourced, and within the county level, resources flow to their highest political use, and not to the services that are used, particularly because women are underrepresented in the political machinery. So what is the argument for money to go to women's priorities if women make up only about 15 or 16% of elected officials? So there's this whole political economy reality that we need to see every decision through a political economy lens that understands public sector choices as political economy choices, that analyzes the interests and incentives of stakeholders, both elected and non-elected, as well as the contestation of power between central or national and county government. Let me stop there. Hopefully this was useful background. Again, I think the real discussion will hopefully take place during the next meeting, where we have an opportunity to be in person and apply some of these concepts to the very real situation that you outlined last time in terms of what should the county governments be doing in Kenya. But let me stop here. Oh, back to you, Jackie.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. I think that was a very interesting presentation. I think I learned quite a bit, and I'm seeing some text messages. Oh, this is very interesting. Thank you, Jamie, for that. I just want to give this opportunity to the technical working group in case anybody has a question. Before we close, we are slightly over our time. Anybody with a question or a point of clarification or a comment? Has this sparked an idea in your mind? Was it helpful? Any aha moments? Anybody, any feedback? Was it useful? Can we see how it aligns to childcare provision and possibly clarifies some of the areas that we were unsure about? I see, yes, George.
Yeah, thanks. I think the presentation is very timely as it helps to galvanize and, consolidate the thoughts we have around, provision of childcare, the nexus between women economic empowerment in Kenya and childcare in Kenya, and how, the relationships between our national government and county governments play into the whole spectrum of providing of these services. So, yeah, from a theoretical perspective, from a theory of change perspective, then you can be able to see how all this falls into place. And so when you read the policy and the constitution and the policies, we are able to then conceptually be able to place each and every one of these national and county government actors in their correct place. And even when we as actors and stakeholders work with the county and national governments, then we are clear in our minds conceptually what is the comparative advantage of each level of government. And so providing our support in a more informed and enlightened way as we work with these levels of government. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it helps us clarify who should be doing what, not just say, okay, childcare is a county function, but unbundling that. I think we heard from Jamie's presentation. Penina, do you want to say anything? I saw you send a celebratory emoji before we close. She might not be able to share with us, but thank you for your feedback. Unfortunately, because of time, we will not be able to get into or try to apply some of the concepts we've learned today with the PEA, try having some preliminary discussions on the PEA. But as promised, during the May discussion, we will be unpacking now the conversations we've had today on why is the county now looking through a political economy lens, why is the county not fulfilling its mandate or implementing the ideas that we have already identified. Just as a reminder, we will be meeting on May 23rd at the Mara Ole Sereni. I have already shared the link for you to confirm your participation. I will send it again through the emails. And during that meeting, we will be, as I said, one of the discussions will be on the political economy analysis, but also I hope that we will also get a chance to discuss with the CAC conference coming up. We have a session. What do we want to communicate during that session? What do we want to achieve during the CAC childcare conference? So thank you so much for creating time. I'm sorry we've gone a little bit overboard, but I'm sure it was a useful exercise. Thank you, Jamie, for creating time to share with us the presentation. I think everybody found it quite informative, and I'm sure we're better placed even to move on to the next step. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sylvia, for helping us with the recap and the minutes. And thank you, Penina and George. I think I also saw Amanda and somebody else from AFECN for joining us. And we will be sharing this link. Hope to see you on May 23rd. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.